Chapter 20: Family and Church Support. Best family churches can offer much more after the violence. Long-term spiritual and emotional support to the survivor. Reverend Tawana Davis. Support from family and church advisors is crucial to a victim's healing. Sadly, there are many ways in which church leaders and others have misunderstood victims, provided harmful advice, or otherwise stalled the healing process in the past. This chapter looks at some of those missteps and suggests ways for avoiding them. Religious exploitation. Bishops, pastors, ministers, and other religious helpers who know how to be aware of the ways victims respond to abuse and how trauma from that abuse manifests itself should also learn to recognize the ways abusers frequently ignore or exploit principles of the gospel. This can happen in a number of ways. Abusers might use their position in a church to elevate their status or to claim there is no way they could be an abuser. Abusers might use principles Jesus taught, such as forgiveness, to minimize their wrongdoings and put responsibility on the victim to be more forgiving. Abusers might also use marriage vows or covenants to make a victim feel trapped in an abusive relationship. If you see any evidence that an individual is exploiting religious principles, take immediate action to assess the situation. Help the victim understand and remember God's love, their divine worth, that they have good men and women who want to support them, and that God would never want any of His children to be in dangerous or harmful situations. Refer to Chapter 4 for more help in this process. Necessary endings. In many Christian churches, divorce is often viewed as a last resort and generally frowned upon. There are, however, many situations where divorce is appropriate, a necessary ending, so to speak. This is especially true for those who are being abused physically, sexually, psychologically, and in other ways that jeopardize the victim's health and safety. Joy Forrest, Executive Director of Called to Peace Ministries, described some of the agony that stems from abuse before recognizing that divorce is sometimes the only option in a failing marriage. As former spokesperson for a domestic violence program, I am fully aware of the prevalence of family violence within the church. In my own small corner of the world, I have seen victims wearing wounds to rival those found on battlefields, and children's faces telling stories of shock and dismay. I have met women who were strangled, stabbed, forced to drink poison, kicked, and punched. I have heard stories of unbelievable intimidation by abusers. One woman watched her husband cut the head off of her dog, and another opened her car door to find her car filled with poisonous snakes. Several perpetrators threatened violence or sexual assault against their own children. Many of these women were Christians and were doubly grieved because their churches offered little or no support. Some reported that their pastors didn't believe their stories or seemed to care more about saving their marriages than their lives. Likewise, President Dallin H. Oaks from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has taught that members who have experienced such abuse have first-hand knowledge of circumstances worse than divorce. When a marriage is dead and beyond hope of resuscitation, it is needful to have a means to end it. It is vital that the people in church settings who are capable of helping a victim recognize this principle, especially because victims may not always be able to see clearly themselves. One writer cautions that sometimes victims tolerate the misbehavior because they don't recognize it as abuse. Unfortunately, well-meaning friends and family may also tolerate abuse if not recognized for what it is. The LDS Church-produced manual, Help for Victims, reminds us that the Lord expects us to be vigilant in preventing abuse and to protect and help those who have been victims of abuse. No one is expected to endure abusive behavior. We absolutely believe that people can change, and we believe that the Savior's atonement is part of that process. However, abusers often have a hard time changing while still in a relationship with someone they have regularly abused. Just like putting alcohol in front of a recovering alcoholic is counterproductive and even dangerous, it is rarely possible for someone with abusive tendencies to change when a person who is conditioned to being abused is part of the equation. Toxic and dangerous relationship dynamics must be broken. When they are, there is hope for both the abuser and the victim. Kristen M.A, a member of the LDS Church's Relief Society General Presidency, taught that on the path of forgiveness and healing lies a choice not to perpetuate unhealthy patterns or relationships in our families or elsewhere. The United Methodist Church teaches its leaders, "We recognize that family violence and abuse in all its forms, verbal, psychological, physical, sexual, is detrimental to the covenant of the human community. We encourage the church to provide a safe environment, counsel, and support for the victim. While we deplore the actions of the abuser, we affirm that person to be in need of God's redeeming love." Victim blaming and shaming. Be wary of counseling victims to just forget about abuse. Forgetting abuse is not healing from abuse. There are necessary steps victims should take in order to heal. Trained. Professional counselors are always the best first choice for victims to consult as they learn about the healing process. But the assistance of spiritual leaders can also be invaluable, as long as those leaders are aware of this one thing. Spiritual leaders must never blame or shame the victim for what happened to them. When we learn that something horrible has happened to someone, a natural first reaction is to try and correct the problem or understand how the problem happened. This, of course, involves asking the victim questions to better understand. As you ask these questions, be very careful in your wording. Take caution not to blame the victim of abuse or say the abuse was a punishment for the victim's sins. Some examples of victim shaming might include focusing on what a young woman who was raped was wearing, wondering if a youth who was victimized could have avoided the situation if they hadn't drunk alcohol, suggesting that a covenant or church marriage, as opposed to a civil marriage, may have protected someone from domestic violence. Abuse is never a punishment from God. No young person deserves to be sexually assaulted, no matter what they are wearing or drinking. And no person deserves to be abused, no matter what religious guidelines they choose to follow or not. Reverend Nicolette Faison reminded her congregation during a recent Domestic Violence Awareness Month that while forgiveness is a Christian value, God intends for us to repent and harm no more. Yet we are more likely to focus on a woman choosing to forgive someone who has no intent of changing their behavior. As a church, we tend to have more of an opinion of what a woman wears, says, and acts, and how that justifies the violence done to her than how we respond to the violence itself. Don't ask questions like, "Why didn't you run or scream?" or "Why did you stay so long?" Instead, say things like, "Thank you for trusting me enough to tell me this," or "This is very hard. How can I help?" Most importantly, always say, "I believe you." John Piper, Chancellor of Bethlehem College and Seminary, reminds us that an abuser is disobeying Christ. He is not to be indulged, but disciplined by the church. The wife is not insubordinate to ask the church for help. A Christian woman should not feel that the only help available to her is the police. That would be a biblical failure of her church. Be aware that if abuse involves a civil or criminal prosecution, defense attorneys might attempt to use victim blaming and shaming in order to help the offender receive minimal or no punishment. Going through this process is often worse for the victim than what originally happened because it reintroduces and potentially repeats the trauma. Religious leaders and other support individuals should help to validate the victim's self-worth and remind her that the abuse has not changed her standing before God or her divine worth. Women as heads of household. One woman who had been divorced from her abusive husband for many years was regularly reminded of her trauma because her church leader failed to see her as the head of the household. She had custody of the children and responsibility over all family and household decisions. Yet, a misguided church leader intentionally and continually reached out to the abuser to pass on messages, church education material, and other important information to the victim wife and children. Not only did this behavior upset the wife and children, it also sent an incorrect message to the children about their mother's authority and place in the family. Single women and mothers have the authority to preside over their families and should be respected as the heads of their household. Elder Dallin H. Oakes explained to his Latter-day Saint audience that, "When my father died, my mother presided over our family. She had no priesthood office, but as the surviving parent in her marriage, she had become the governing officer in her family. At the same time, she was always totally respectful of the priesthood authority of our bishop and other church leaders. She presided over her family, but they presided over the church. As you support women who are suddenly thrust into the position of head of the household, do so with respect to her authority as a leader, protector, and provider of the family. Remember, though, that in situations where a woman has been abused and is mentally, socially, physically, financially, and emotionally still learning to regulate and recover, that the transition to being both the primary caregiver and the primary breadwinner will be rocky. She will need love, support, and regular relief. Betrayal trauma and trusting clergy. Leaders of many faiths understand that one awful result is a deepening lack of trust in others, which becomes a barrier to healing. Victims may be too frightened to seek help from church leaders due to the abuser's alienation efforts, smear campaigns, and use of unrighteous dominion. Generally, abuse victims tend to be fearful of people in power and control positions, which also makes it difficult to go to church leaders for help. It's also common for victims whose abusers conflated priesthood authority with male superiority to be suspicious of any priesthood authority. When a victim is mourning the loss of a dream and is shaken in their reality of what is true and safe and what is abusive and controlling, religious beliefs can become difficult to navigate. Especially for those who have had religion weaponized against them. Because of this, some victims may actually decide to leave their religious communities and their faith. Abusers may then capitalize on this to discredit the victim and hide their own part in the destructive circumstances. Church leaders who are aware of these dynamics will be able to act more sensitively as they help victims. Perhaps their thoughtful approach will also help victims reestablish trust in religious principles. Sometimes, in a situation where a victim feels betrayed or traumatized by religion, it may be helpful to step aside and bring in others who have experienced and healed from domestic violence to help support the victim. The social phenomenon of women banding together during difficult times to support each other is powerful. And the church leader who introduces a victim of abuse to such a support system may very well be saving a life. In conclusion, I hope this book has been beneficial to all who have read it and who seek to understand abuse and how to help victims of abuse. With better understanding, church leaders and friends can help support victims of abuse and crime in ways that will lead to positive healing. Beyond that, I hope that none of us will forget where the purest, most complete, and all-encompassing healing can be found. Elder Patrick Kieran spoke powerfully to individuals in search of this kind of healing, particularly those who feel as if they are living a survival story right now as a victim of abuse, neglect, bullying, domestic violence, or any suffering of this kind. You are in the midst, he said, of your own desperate attempt to survive a situation that feels very much like a disastrous shipwreck or a promising mission suddenly aborted. Will you ever be rescued? Will you make it through your own survival story? His answer? Yes. You can survive. You have in fact already been rescued. You have already been saved by the one who has suffered the very torment you are suffering and endured the very agony you are enduring. Jesus has overcome the abuses of this world to give you power to not only survive, but one day, through him, to overcome and even conquer, to completely rise above the pain, the misery, the anguish, and see them replaced by peace. May all who are abused end up conquerors, their anguish replaced by peace.